In the cold, merciless waters of the North Atlantic during World War II, where grey waves stretched to the horizon and death lurked beneath every swell, one American destroyer squadron would execute the most audacious anti-submarine trap in naval history. This is the story of how 5 American destroyers deliberately allowed themselves to be surrounded by 8 German U-boats and then systematically hunted down and destroyed every single one of them in just 4 hours of intense combat. It was a gamble that defied every tactical doctrine, a strategy so dangerous that it bordered on madness. Yet, on the night of April 23, 1943, Commander James Sullivan and his destroyer squadron would prove that sometimes the best defense is not to defend at all, but to turn the hunter into the hunted. What happened in those 4 hours would change anti-submarine warfare forever and send shockwaves through the German Kriegsmarine that would never fully recover. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stage for this extraordinary engagement was set not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, methodical work of Allied intelligence officers hunched over decryption machines in a nondescript building in London. For months, British and American codebreakers had been reading German naval communications with increasing regularity, courtesy of captured Enigma machines and the brilliant work of mathematicians who had cracked the supposedly unbreakable code. On April 20, 1943, intercepted German radio traffic revealed something extraordinary. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, was assembling a massive wolf pack of 23 submarines to intercept convoy HX-234, a critical supply convoy of 67 merchant ships carrying war material from New York to Liverpool. The Germans had designated this operation Gruppe Löwenherz, or Lionheart Group, and Dönitz had personally selected some of his most experienced U-boat commanders for the mission. But the intercepted messages revealed something even more valuable than the attack plan itself. The Germans had established a precise patrol line where the U-boats would wait, stretched across the convoy's projected route like an underwater picket fence. Each submarine had been assigned specific coordinates, and the rigid German adherence to operational orders meant they would be exactly where the decoded messages said they would be. This intelligence landed on the desk of Admiral Jonas Richardson, commander of the Western Atlantic Escort Forces, at his headquarters in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Richardson was a veteran of the First World War who had witnessed the carnage U-boats could inflict on merchant shipping. He had lost too many good men and too many precious ships to the underwater menace, but now, for the first time, he had an opportunity not just to defend a convoy, but to strike a devastating blow against the wolf pack itself. Richardson summoned Commander James Sullivan to his office. Sullivan was the 42-year-old commander of Destroyer Squadron 18, consisting of 5 Fletcher-class destroyers: USS Bainbridge, USS Harper, USS Montgomery, USS Sullivan, and USS Thornton. These were not the old 4-stacker destroyers of the previous war, but modern, purpose-built submarine killers, bristling with the latest anti-submarine technology. Each Fletcher-class destroyer displaced 2,100 tons, fully loaded, and measured 376 feet from bow to stern. They were armed with 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, and most importantly for the coming battle, a complete suite of anti-submarine weapons, including depth charge racks, K-gun depth charge projectors, and the revolutionary Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar. The Hedgehog represented the cutting edge of anti-submarine warfare technology. Unlike traditional depth charges that detonated at preset depths regardless of whether they were near a submarine, the Hedgehog fired 24 contact-fused projectiles in an elliptical pattern ahead of the attacking ship. Each 65-pound projectile would only explode on direct contact with a submarine's hull, meaning that a hit was instantly lethal, while a miss left the water undisturbed, allowing sonar operators to maintain continuous contact with their target. But the real innovation that would prove decisive in the coming engagement was not weaponry but tactics. Sullivan had spent months studying the methods developed by British Captain Frederick John Walker, the Royal Navy's most successful submarine hunter. Walker had pioneered the creeping attack, a coordinated assault where one ship maintained sonar contact while directing another ship to slowly approach the submarine for a surprise attack. Sullivan had refined this concept further, developing coordinated tactics for multiple destroyers to attack simultaneously from different directions. As Richardson laid out the intelligence before him, Sullivan immediately grasped both the opportunity and the enormous risk. "Admiral," he said, his voice steady despite the racing of his pulse, "you're not suggesting we escort the convoy. You want us to go hunting?" Richardson nodded, his weathered face grave. "The convoy has adequate escort. 6 destroyers and 12 corvettes will see them through, but we have precise coordinates for 8 U-boats forming the southern end of their patrol line. If we can eliminate them before they ever reach the convoy, we save ships, we save lives, and we deal a psychological blow to their wolf-pack tactics." Sullivan studied the map, his tactical mind already racing through possibilities. The 8 U-boats were spread across a 100-mile front, positioned to intercept the convoy as it passed through their patrol zone. The submarines would be running on the surface at night to recharge batteries and make better speed to their assigned positions. They would be vulnerable, but deadly. "There's something else," Richardson continued, sliding a classified folder across his desk. "Our intelligence indicates these 8 boats are all Type 7C U-boats, the workhorses of their fleet. But more importantly, several of these commanders are veterans of the happy time, when they were sinking our ships with impunity off the East Coast. This is a chance to settle some old scores." Sullivan opened the folder and scanned the list of U-boat commanders. U-309 under Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, 12 ships sunk. U-417 commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Wolfgang Schneider, 8 ships. U-521 under Captain Lieutenant Dieter Krause, 15 ships including 2 destroyers. These were not novices, but battle-hardened killers who knew every trick of submarine warfare. "What you're proposing is extremely dangerous, sir," Sullivan said carefully. "If we go after them directly, they'll detect us and scatter. We'd be lucky to get 1 or 2. "That's why you're not going after them," Richardson replied with a thin smile. "You're going to let them come to you." Over the next 2 hours, Richardson and Sullivan hammered out a plan so audacious it made Sullivan's blood run cold. Destroyer Squadron 18 would position itself in the center of the U-boat patrol line and broadcast on all frequencies that they were a damaged tanker and her escorts, proceeding independently after suffering storm damage that forced them to leave the convoy. They would make themselves look like easy prey, 4 or 5 ships alone in the middle of the Atlantic with no air cover, no support, and no way to call for help. The U-boats, detecting this vulnerable target, would converge for the kill. It was standard Wolfpack doctrine to concentrate overwhelming force against isolated targets. The destroyers would allow the U-boats to close in, surrounding them, bringing the submarines into a killing box, where the American ships could use their superior surface speed, radar, sonar, and coordinated tactics to systematically destroy every U-boat that took the bait. "If they get off even a few torpedo spreads before we spring the trap," Richardson warned, "you could lose ships. If they submerge and scatter, you might get 1 or 2, but the rest will escape and report what happened, compromising our intelligence source. And if you're still engaged when the main Wolfpack arrives, you'll be fighting 23 U-boats instead of 8. Sullivan met the Admiral's eyes. "High risk, high reward. I understand, sir. My squadron can do this." "I'm not ordering you to do this, Commander. I'm asking. You and your captains can refuse this mission with no prejudice to your records. It's that dangerous." Sullivan stood, his jaw set with determination. "With respect, Admiral, my ship is the USS Sullivan, named for the 5 brothers who died together at Guadalcanal. Those boys didn't get to choose whether they faced danger. My men and I volunteer for this mission. We'll sink every damned U-boat that takes the bait, or we'll go down trying." Richardson rose and extended his hand. Godspeed, Commander. The Atlantic depends on you. Sullivan assembled his 5 captains in the operations room of USS Bainbridge, the squadron flagship. Lieutenant Commander Michael Chen of USS Harper, Lieutenant Commander Robert Jackson of USS Montgomery, Lieutenant Commander Patrick O'Brien of USS Sullivan, and Lieutenant Commander David Martinez of USS Thornton gathered around the chart table as Sullivan laid out the plan. The reaction was immediate and divided. Chen, a former submariner himself who had transferred to destroyers, was the first to voice concerns. Commander, this goes against every tactical principle we've been taught. Allowing yourself to be surrounded is how ships die. We'll be in the center of a circle with torpedoes coming from every direction. That's exactly why it will work, Sullivan countered. They'll expect us to run, to scatter, to call for help. When we don't do any of those things, when we instead turn and attack, they won't know how to respond. And while they're trying to figure it out, we'll be killing them. O'Brien, whose Irish temperament made him the most aggressive of the captains, grinned. It's crazy enough to work. Besides, most of these U-boat types have gotten cocky. They think they own the Atlantic. Time to teach them different. Martinez, the cautious planner of the group, studied the chart with narrowed eyes. Timing is everything. If we spring the trap too early, they'll have time to dive and escape. Too late, and they'll get their torpedoes in the water. We need to calculate the exact moment when they're committed to the attack, but haven't yet reached firing position. Jackson, the squadron's expert on anti-submarine warfare, nodded. And we need perfect coordination. This only works if all 5 ships act as one. We'll need to maintain radio silence to preserve the deception, which means we'll rely entirely on pre-arranged signals and each captain's tactical judgment. Sullivan leaned over the chart, his finger tracing the positions where the U-boats were expected to be. Here's how we'll do it. We proceed at 8 knots, low speed to appear damaged. We'll be in a loose box formation, about 2,000 yards apart. That gives us mutual support but looks like a scattered group of ships in trouble. We broadcast our distress calls starting at 1800 hours tomorrow. The U-boats will be on the surface at night, charging batteries and making better speed. They'll detect our radio transmissions and move to intercept. Based on their probable positions and speed, I estimate they'll converge on us beginning around 2200 hours. By midnight, we should have all 8 in proximity. Chen interrupted. What about their radios? Won't they be communicating with each other, coordinating the attack? That's where our advantage comes in, Sullivan explained. These boats are maintaining radio silence except for critical messages. They won't break that discipline unless they think they've found something big. Once they close in and realize we're destroyers, not merchants, it will be too late. We'll be inside their torpedo range, but so will they be inside ours. He paused, meeting each captain's eyes in turn. The key is patience. We let them come. We hold fire. We let them think they have us surrounded, helpless, doomed. And then, at exactly 2300 hours, we turn on every searchlight, activate full radar, and light them up like it's daylight. The shock and confusion will buy us precious minutes. In those minutes, we destroy them. Martinez raised a critical question. What's our engagement order? We can't all go after the same targets. Sullivan had already planned for this. Each ship is assigned 2 sectors based on compass bearings. Bainbridge takes north and northeast. Harper takes east and southeast. Montgomery takes south and southwest. Sullivan takes west and northwest. Thornton is our mobile reserve, free to engage targets of opportunity or reinforce any ship that gets in trouble. The hedgehogs will be our primary weapons. 1 hit, 1 kill. We save depth charges for any boat that manages to submerge. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. O'Brien whistled low. 48 hedgehog projectiles per ship, 5 ships, that's 240 projectiles in the first salvo alone. If we catch them on the surface, it'll be a massacre. That's the idea, Sullivan said grimly. But remember, these are not rookies we're fighting. These are experienced commanders who've survived years of combat. They're smart, they're skilled, and they're absolutely deadly. One mistake on our part, one torpedo that finds its mark, and this whole plan falls apart. We have to be perfect. Jackson leaned back, his expression thoughtful. There's one more factor we haven't discussed. The weather. The forecast calls for partial clouds, moderate seas, wind 15 knots from the northwest. That's actually ideal conditions for surface engagements. Good visibility for us with our radar, but the U-boats will be relying on visual detection and acoustics. We'll see them before they see us clearly. Gentlemen, Sullivan said, I won't lie to you. This is the most dangerous mission any of us will ever undertake. But if we succeed, we'll save hundreds of merchant sailors' lives, protect vital war supplies, and prove that the U-boat wolf packs are not invincible. More than that, we'll be avenging every Allied sailor who's died in these cold waters. Are you with me? One by one, the captains stood and saluted. Aye, sir, they said in unison. At 1400 hours, on April 22nd, 1943, destroyer Squadron 18 departed Halifax Harbour in line-ahead formation, quickly working up to 25 knots as they headed into the North Atlantic. To any observer, they appeared to be a standard escort group heading out to meet an incoming convoy. But in the radio room of each destroyer, operators were preparing special transmissions that would begin the following evening. The weather was grey and cold, typical for April in the North Atlantic. Seas were running at 6 to 8 feet, enough to make the destroyers roll in their characteristic long, swooping motion, but nothing that would impede operations. The wind carried the taste of salt and the promise of violence. Sullivan stood on Bainbridge's bridge wing, watching his squadron settle into formation. These were good ships, good men. The Fletcher-class destroyers had proven themselves in the Pacific against the Japanese, but relatively few had seen action in the Atlantic, where the enemy was silent, invisible, and struck without warning from beneath the waves. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Reed, joined him at the rail. Captain, the crew knows something unusual is up. They can feel it. Sullivan nodded. Gather all hands. They deserve to know what we're about to do. 30 minutes later, Sullivan stood before his crew on Bainbridge's main deck, with the ship-wide announcing system carrying his voice to every compartment. His words were being simultaneously broadcast to the other 4 destroyers. Men, he began, his voice calm and steady, tomorrow evening we're going hunting, but we're not hunting the normal way. We're going to make ourselves bait for a German wolf pack, let 8 U-boats surround us, and then we're going to sink every single one of them. The shock on the sailors' faces was palpable. Sullivan pressed on. I know this sounds crazy. It probably is crazy. But here's what you need to understand. Every day, merchant sailors die in these waters, killed by U-boats that attack from the darkness and disappear back into the depths. Every cargo of supplies that goes to the bottom makes this war longer, makes victory harder. We have a chance to strike a blow that will save lives, protect supplies, and show the Germans that their submarines are not invincible. He paused, letting his words sink in. This will be the most dangerous night of your lives. The U-boats will have us surrounded. If we fail, if we miss even one boat that gets its torpedoes off, we could lose ships. But I believe in this crew. I believe in this squadron. And I believe that come dawn, on April 24th, we're going to have sent 8 U-boats to the bottom. A young seaman, barely 19 years old, raised his hand. Sir, what if they don't take the bait? Sullivan smiled grimly. Then we'll have had a nice evening cruise. But trust me, son, they'll take the bait. The Germans are good, but they're arrogant. They think they own the Atlantic. Tomorrow night, we teach them otherwise." The crew erupted in cheers, the fear and tension breaking into determination. Whatever happened, they would face it together. At 1800 hours on April 23rd, USS Bainbridge began broadcasting on all standard maritime frequencies. Mayday. 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 This is merchant tanker Beaumont, en route from New York to Liverpool. Have suffered severe storm damage to steering mechanism and fuel contamination in number 2 bunker, unable to maintain convoy speed. Request assistance. Position 48 degrees north, 35 degrees west. The message repeated every 15 minutes. It was carefully crafted to sound genuine. A tanker in trouble, valuable target, isolated and vulnerable. The position given placed them directly in the center of the known U-boat patrol line. In the radio room of U-309, Kapitän Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann listened to the distress call with growing interest. He had been at sea for 32 days, his diesel engines consuming precious fuel as he took position for the attack on the expected convoy. The prospect of an easy kill before the main battle was tempting. Hartmann was a veteran of the 1942 happy time, when U-boats had operated with near impunity off the American East Coast. He had personally sunk 12 ships, including 3 tankers filled with precious fuel oil. But lately, the Atlantic had become more dangerous. The Americans had finally organized proper convoy escorts, aircraft patrols were more frequent, and several of his friends had failed to return from patrol. He called his radio operator. "Did you get a fix on that transmission?" "Jawohl, Herr Kapitän. Approximately 80 kilometers northeast of our position." Hartmann studied his charts. The location was slightly south of the expected convoy route, which made sense if the ship had been forced to fall behind. A single tanker with a handful of escorts would be easy prey. And yet, something about the transmission bothered him. It was almost too perfect, too detailed. He made his decision. Send a coded message to BDU, possible lone tanker identified at given coordinates. Request permission to investigate and attack if confirmed. We'll approach on the surface under cover of darkness, use our superior night vision to confirm the target, and then strike. What Hartmann didn't know was that 7 other U-boat commanders were making the exact same decision. The bait had been taken. At 2100 hours, as twilight faded into darkness, Sullivan's destroyers were in position. They had killed their running lights, operating now under full blackout conditions, but they maintained their slow, steady course, as if unaware of the danger converging from all directions. On every ship, crews stood at battle stations, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. On Bainbridge's bridge, the radar operator called out contacts. Multiple surface contacts, bearing 015, range 22,000 yards. Count 2, possibly 3 targets. Speed approximately 15 knots, closing. "That's them," Sullivan said quietly. "Sound general quarters. Pass to all ships by signal lamp. Enemy in sight. Hold formation. Hold fire until my command." Across the darkened sea, signal lamps flickered, acknowledging the order. The destroyers continued their slow progress, apparently oblivious to the steel sharks that were closing in for the kill. In the sonar room, Chief Petty Officer Mike Anderson hunched over his equipment, listening intently to the sounds of the sea. He had been a sonar operator for 4 years, and he could identify sounds that would be meaningless to untrained ears. Now, he heard the distinctive throb of diesel engines, multiple sources, closing from different directions. Sonar contact, bearing 320, range 18,000 yards. Second contact, bearing 085, range 16,000 yards. "Sir, we're being surrounded." Sullivan nodded calmly, though his heart was pounding. "Very well. Maintain course and speed. All weapons ready, but hold fire." At 2200 hours, U-309 surfaced to periscope depth 3 miles north of the American formation. Through his periscope, Hartmann could make out dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. But something was wrong. The silhouettes were too angular, too low to be a tanker. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at him suddenly crystallized into understanding. "Destroyers," he hissed. "It's a trap. Dive! Dive! Emergency dive!" But before his diving klaxon could sound, the night exploded into brilliant, blinding light. At exactly 2300 hours, Sullivan gave the command that sealed the fate of 8 U-boats. "All ships, execute. Lights on, full power, engage at will." 5 destroyers simultaneously switched on their searchlights and activated their surface search radars. 8 U-boats caught on the surface were suddenly illuminated as if by 1,000 suns, their grey hulls stark against the dark water. The submarine's lookouts, their night vision destroyed by the sudden glare, could only stare in shock and horror. Target bearing 012, range 8,000 yards. The fire control officer aboard Bainbridge shouted, "Solution set! Hedgehog, fire!" Sullivan commanded. With a rippling series of thumps, 24 Hedgehog projectiles arced through the night air, tracing bright parabolas before splashing into the water ahead of U-309. The submarine was already crash diving, her ballast tanks flooding, her bow tilting downward. But she was not diving fast enough. 7 projectiles struck the submarine's hull with devastating force. The contact-fused warheads detonated instantly, tearing through the pressure hull like paper. The explosions ruptured the submarine's ballast tanks, collapsed internal bulkheads, and flooded the control room. U-309's bow plunged downward, her stern lifting out of the water for a moment before she slid beneath the surface, taking all 48 hands with her to a depth of 3 miles. "Hit! Confirmed kill!" the sonar operator shouted. "Target is breaking up. I hear explosions. She's going down." But there was no time to celebrate. Aboard USS Harper, Lieutenant Commander Chen had locked onto U-417, which was frantically attempting to turn away and submerge. The German commander, Oberleutnant Wolfgang Schneider, had the presence of mind to order his deck gun manned, hoping to fight his way out of the trap. Chen didn't give him the chance. "Forward 5-inch mounts, rapid fire. Hedgehog, fire when ready." Harper's forward 5-inch guns spoke in rapid succession, their shells screaming across the 2 miles of water separating the ships. The first salvo fell short, sending up geysers of water that bracketed the submarine. The second salvo struck home. A shell penetrated the submarine's conning tower, killing everyone on the bridge. Another struck the deck, destroying the gun mount before it could fire a single shot. As U-417 wallowed, her dive hindered by the damage, Harper's Hedgehog fired. 18 of the 24 projectiles found their mark. The submarine simply disintegrated, torn apart by the multiple explosions. Her stern broke away from the bow, both sections sinking separately. There were no survivors. USS Montgomery, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Jackson, engaged 2 U-boats simultaneously, U-521 and U-608, which had been approaching from the south in a coordinated attack. The 2 submarines were so close together that Jackson made a split-second decision to treat them as a single target. "All guns commence firing. Alternate salvos between targets. Hedgehog crew, load double pattern." Montgomery's 5-inch guns spoke in a steady drumbeat, raking both submarines with high explosive shells. U-608, the closer of the 2, took 3 direct hits that set her fuel tanks on fire. Flames erupted from her hull, silhouetting the submarine against the darkness. Her commander, seeing his boat was doomed, ordered his crew to abandon ship. German submariners spilled from the hatches, jumping into the cold Atlantic as their boat burned. U-608 settled by the stern, her bow lifting high into the air before she plunged downward. Montgomery would later rescue 17 survivors from the frigid water. U-521, commanded by the veteran Kapitänleutnant Dieter Krause, proved more elusive. Krause was one of the Kriegsmarine's most successful U-boat commanders. and he instantly recognized that survival depended on reaching deep water. He ordered emergency dive procedures even as Montgomery's shells fell around him. The submarine submerged with only seconds to spare, disappearing beneath the surface just as Montgomery's hedgehog salvo splashed into the water where she had been. But Jackson was not about to let this one escape. "Sonar, maintain contact. All ahead full, close the range, prepare for creeping attack." This was the tactic Sullivan had drilled them on for months, adapted from Captain Walker's successful methods. Montgomery slowed to 5 knots, using her sonar to track the submarine as it desperately maneuvered below. Meanwhile, USS Thornton, the squadron's roving reserve, raced to join the attack at 25 knots. Contact bearing 270, range 1,200 yards, depth 200 feet. The sonar operator called. "Target is turning to port, increasing speed." Jackson coordinated with Thornton by signal lamp, directing the other destroyer to approach from the opposite direction. The two ships would attack simultaneously, giving the submarine nowhere to hide. "Steady as she goes," Jackson ordered calmly. "Hedgehog crew, stand by. Fire on my mark." At 800 yards, with perfect sonar contact, Jackson gave the order. Montgomery's Hedgehog fired its deadly pattern ahead. 2 seconds later, Thornton's Hedgehog fired from the opposite direction. The combined 48 projectiles created a lethal pattern that no submarine could evade. U-521 took at least 12 direct hits. The explosions collapsed her pressure hull, flooded her compartments, and sent her spiraling into the abyss. Krauss and his crew of 52 men died instantly, their submarine becoming a steel tomb on the ocean floor. Aboard USS Sullivan, Lieutenant Commander O'Brien was living up to his reputation for aggressive action. He had identified U-724 attempting to flee to the west and was pursuing at full speed, his destroyer's bow throwing up white bow waves as she knifed through the seas at 30 knots. "That boat's trying to run for it," O'Brien shouted. "Like hell he will! All ahead flank! Guns! Continuous fire! Keep his head down!" Submarine, commanded by Oberleutnant Helmut Fischer, was racing on the surface, knowing that his electric motors would be too slow to escape. It became a chase, destroyer versus submarine, with Sullivan slowly closing the range. O'Brien's 5-inch guns fired continuously, their shells falling all around the fleeing submarine. One shell struck a glancing blow off the conning tower, ricocheted into the air, and exploded harmlessly. But the effect was to force the submarine to maneuver erratically, slowing her escape. At a range of 4,000 yards, O'Brien ordered a bold maneuver. "Helm, hard right rudder! Bring us broadside to the target. Torpedoes, prepare to fire full spread." It was almost unheard of for a destroyer to use her torpedoes against a submarine, but O'Brien recognized that his 10 21-inch torpedoes had longer range than his Hedgehog and were just as deadly. Sullivan heeled over hard as she turned, presenting her broadside to the fleeing submarine. Torpedoes. Fire spread of 5. 5 torpedoes leaped from their tubes, splashing into the water and accelerating to 46 knots. At this range, they would reach the submarine in less than 3 minutes. Fischer, watching from his conning tower, saw the telltale wakes streaking toward him through the night. He had one chance. Emergency dive. All hands below. Dive, dive, dive. U-724's klaxon sounded as the crew raced to submerge their boat. But they were racing against time and mathematics, and both were against them. The submarine's bow dipped below the surface, just as the first torpedo reached her position. It passed overhead by 3 feet, missing. The second torpedo struck her stern just as the propellers went under. The explosion destroyed U-724's propulsion system, blew off her rudder, and flooded her aft torpedo room. The submarine lost all power and began sinking by the stern, settling at an angle of 30 degrees. Inside the stricken submarine, Fischer knew his boat was doomed. "All hands, abandon ship, surface the boat, get the crew out." U-724's crew blew her ballast tanks, using compressed air to force the water out and bring the boat back to the surface. The submarine broke through into the night air, listing heavily to port, her stern underwater. Hatches flew open and German submariners poured out, launching life rafts and helping wounded shipmates into the cold Atlantic. O'Brien, watching the submarine wallow, made a decision that would later be praised by his superiors. Ceasefire, rescue stations. We're taking survivors. USS Sullivan approached the sinking submarine carefully, launching boats to pick up survivors. 29 German submariners were pulled from the water, including Fisher himself. U-724 slipped beneath the waves 10 minutes later, her bow pointing skyward before she plunged into the depths. The remaining 3 U-boats faced similar fates in rapid succession. U-496, caught on the surface by USS Bainbridge, was hit by 4 Hedgehog projectiles and sank within 3 minutes. U-533 attempted to crash dive, but was caught at periscope depth by a perfectly executed creeping attack from Harper and Thornton, receiving 9 Hedgehog hits that broke her back and sent her to the bottom. The last submarine, U-615, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Otto Schneider, proved to be the most difficult. Schneider was a crafty commander who had survived 2 years of combat by being unpredictable. When the destroyers illuminated the area, he immediately dove and went silent, cutting his electric motors and letting his submarine drift with the current, hoping to evade detection. For 30 minutes, the American destroyers searched for him, their sonars pinging into the darkness. But U-615 was playing dead, her crew ordered to absolute silence, every piece of equipment switched off except life support. In the submarine's dark, silent interior, German sailors stood motionless, barely breathing, praying their boat wouldn't be found. Sullivan, coordinating the search from Bainbridge, recognized the tactic. He's gone quiet, hoping we'll give up and leave. Standard procedure is to search for an hour and then break off, but we're not standard. All ships form picket line at 2-mile intervals. Begin systematic sonar sweep, pattern alpha. We'll grid search every square mile of ocean until we find him. It was Chief Petty Officer Anderson whose skilled ear finally detected the submarine. Sir, I have something. Bearing 185, range 3,200 yards. It's faint, but I'm hearing sounds consistent with a submarine at deep depth. Sounds like someone dropped something, maybe a wrench or a tool. Brief metallic clang, then silence again. Sullivan smiled grimly. That's our boy. One of his crew made a mistake. Guide us in, Chief. Bainbridge crept forward at bare steerage way, her sonar painting a picture of what lay below. At a depth of 350 feet, far deeper than most submarines normally operated, U-615 was doing her best to hide. But she could not remain silent forever. Her batteries were running low, her air was becoming foul with carbon dioxide, and sooner or later she would have to surface or suffocate. Sullivan decided not to wait. Prepare for creeping attack. Harper, come in from the east. I want your firing solution coordinated with ours. We'll bracket him with a double hedgehog pattern. The 2 destroyers positioned themselves on opposite sides of the submarine, their sonar maintaining perfect contact. At Sullivan's signal, both ships fired their hedgehogs simultaneously, 48 projectiles entering the water from different directions. Schneider, in U-615's control room, heard the splashes through his hull. They've found us! Emergency blow! Surface! Surface! Get us up! But it was too late. The hedgehog projectiles, sinking at different rates from different angles, created an inescapable pattern. 12 projectiles struck U-615's pressure hull in rapid succession. The explosions were catastrophic. The submarine's hull collapsed like a crushed can, killing everyone instantly from the shockwave and massive pressure changes. U-615 imploded at depth, scattering debris across the ocean floor. At 0 to 100 hours on April 24, 1943, Commander Sullivan transmitted a coded message to Admiral Richardson in Halifax. Mission accomplished. 8 enemy submarines destroyed. All own ships undamaged. proceeding to base. The entire engagement, from the moment the searchlights were turned on until the last submarine was destroyed, had taken exactly 4 hours and 7 minutes. 8 U-boats totaling 4,700 tons of displacement and 396 trained submariners had been erased from the Kriegsmarine's order of battle. And not a single American sailor had been killed. The return to Halifax 3 days later was triumphant. Admiral Richardson personally greeted Sullivan and his squadron at the dock, and the news of their victory quickly spread through the fleet. The tactical brilliance of deliberately allowing themselves to be surrounded and then turning the tables on the attackers became required study at the Naval War College. But the impact of the engagement went far beyond just the 8 submarines destroyed. In the German Submarine Command headquarters in France, Gross Admiral Dönitz received the news with shock and horror. The loss of 8 boats in a single action was a devastating blow. Even worse was the implication that the Americans had somehow known exactly where his patrol line would be. Dönitz immediately ordered the remaining 15 U-boats of Gruppe Löwenherz to break off their attack on convoy HX-234 and return to base. The convoy sailed to England without losing a single ship. More significantly, German confidence in their Wolfpack tactics was severely shaken. Never again would U-boat commanders approach an isolated group of surface ships with the same arrogance and certainty they had before. The engagement also validated the tactical innovations that Sullivan and his captains had developed. The coordinated use of multiple destroyers in hunter-killer groups, the effective employment of the hedgehog, and the psychological impact of aggressive offensive action against submarines became standard doctrine for the U.S. Navy's anti-submarine forces. Commander Sullivan was promoted to captain and awarded the Navy Cross. Each of his destroyer captains received the Silver Star. The entire squadron received the Presidential Unit Citation for their extraordinary achievement. But Sullivan always insisted that the credit belonged to his crews, the men who stood at their battle stations through 4 hours of intense combat and never wavered. In the years after the war, historians would debate whether the engagement had been brilliant or reckless, whether Sullivan had been lucky or skilled. The truth, as Sullivan himself acknowledged, was probably a combination of both. But what could not be debated was the result. 8 U-boats destroyed in 4 hours, with no American losses, in one of the most audacious tactical gambits in naval history. The German submariners who survived to be pulled from the water by the American destroyers were stunned by what had happened. Captain Lieutenant Fischer, commander of U-724, later told his interrogators, "We thought we had them surrounded, that we were the hunters. We were wrong. They knew exactly what they were doing. They made us think we had the advantage, and then they destroyed us systematically, professionally, without mercy. I have never encountered such tactical skill." The wreckage of the 8 U-boats still lies on the floor of the North Atlantic, scattered across 100 square miles of ocean. They are war graves, protected by international law, reminders of the men who went down with them into the eternal darkness. On the bridge of each submarine, according to German naval custom, the commander would have been the last man to leave the conning tower before the final dive. Most never had that chance. For the families back in Germany who received the dreaded telegram, informing them that their sons, husbands, and fathers were missing and presumed lost at sea, the war became intensely personal. The U-boat service suffered a 75% casualty rate during World War II, the highest of any military service on either side. These 8 boats and their crews joined the 30,000 other German submariners who never came home, but the strategic implications of their loss extended far beyond the individual tragedies. Every submarine sunk was one less threat to Allied shipping. Every trained submarine crew lost was irreplaceable, as Germany's training infrastructure could not keep pace with losses. And every tactical defeat eroded the psychological edge that had made the Wolfpack so effective in the early years of the war. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue for another 2 years after this engagement, with victories and defeats on both sides. But the tide had already begun to turn against the U-boats by April 1943. Improved radar, better anti-submarine weapons, increased numbers of escort vessels, and the closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap, where U-boats had once operated with relative safety, all contributed to the growing Allied advantage. Destroyer Squadron 18's battle was a decisive moment in the Atlantic War. In a daring gamble, 5 American destroyers allowed 8 German U-boats to surround them, then annihilated every one in 4 hours of combat. The engagement proved that aggressive, coordinated tactics could defeat even elite submarine crews and shaped future Allied anti-submarine doctrine. Commander James Sullivan, who led the squadron, later reflected that war demanded hard choices, but respected courage on both sides. All 5 destroyers survived, earning multiple battle stars. Their victory demonstrated that innovation, teamwork, and resolve could triumph against formidable odds and turn hunters into the hunted. Author's note: this narrative is a fictionalized dramatization created for educational and entertainment purposes. While based on actual World War II anti-submarine warfare tactics, technology, and principles employed during the Battle of the Atlantic, the specific engagement described, the ships named, and the characters portrayed are fictional creations. The tactical methods described, including the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, sonar technology, and coordinated attack procedures, are historically accurate representations of the equipment and tactics used during the period. The story honors the courage of all sailors, on both sides, who fought in the Battle of the Atlantic, one of the longest and most critical campaigns of World War II. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.